In the 1st century before the Common Era, the lands that would one day become France, Belgium, Switzerland, and parts of Western Germany were a patchwork of peoples who called themselves Celts, though the Romans would call them Gauls. Their world was one of tribes and chieftains, of alliances sealed by feasts and broken by betrayal, of druids who preserved sacred knowledge, and warriors whose reputations were carved in scars and blood. It was a landscape divided by rivers, forests, and mountain ranges, but also by politics more fragmented than any Roman might imagine. Dozens of tribes lived in this land, some vast and powerful, others small and tenuous, all constantly shifting between war and peace. To the outsider, Gaul appeared chaotic, a mosaic of cultures bound together by common language and customs, yet never united in purpose. In Gaul, prestige was measured in the size of one's retinue, in the number of warriors who would answer a chieftain's call. Rivalries were not simply between tribes, but even within them, as noble families contended for supremacy. Druids served as spiritual leaders, teachers, and judges, weaving a common thread through a fractured political tapestry. Their rituals, their sacrifices, and their oral traditions gave the Gauls a sense of identity distinct from their neighbors. Yet that very fragmentation, those ceaseless rivalries, would prove their greatest weakness when Rome turned its gaze north. For the Romans, Gaul was not some distant wilderness. It was their frontier. To the south lay the wealthy and well-integrated province of Gallia Narbonensis, conquered decades earlier, and a vital artery connecting Italy to Spain. The lands beyond, however, remained independent, restless, and potentially dangerous. Raiding parties sometimes swept across the borders, while migratory tribes threatened to spill into Roman territory, as the Cimbri and Teutones had done a generation before. To Roman senators, Gaul was a land of resources, farmland, and manpower waiting to be harnessed, but also a shield against threats that might destabilize the Republic itself. And in this volatile borderland, a man seeking power saw opportunity. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. In 59 BC, Caesar secured the consulship of Rome, the highest elected office in the Republic. Yet his year in power left him politically vulnerable. His reforms, designed to benefit allies and himself, had stirred fierce opposition in the Senate. Worse still, Caesar was deeply in debt. Years of political maneuvering, bribery, and public generosity had drained his coffers. He had borrowed heavily to secure his rise, and creditors loomed like vultures. The consulship had given him prestige, but prestige without wealth and military success was fleeting in Rome's ruthless politics. He needed more. He needed triumphs that would silence his rivals, and fortune that would free him from financial chains. When Caesar's consulship ended, he maneuvered to secure a proconsular command not in Italy, but across the Alps. Through careful political negotiation, indeed through the alliance known as the First Triumvirate with Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus, he obtained an extraordinary 5-year command over Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. On paper, it was a provincial posting. In reality, it placed him at the head of several legions and on the doorstep of a land ripe for conquest. Caesar understood that military glory was the surest path to power in Rome. A commander who returned triumphant could secure a triumphal procession, fill his coffers with plunder, and command the loyalty of soldiers who would fight for him rather than for the Senate. The people of Rome adored military heroes, and the Senate feared them. For Caesar, Gaul offered the perfect stage on which to craft his legend. But fortune also played its part. Even as Caesar took up his command, events unfolded in Gaul that would draw him in. The Helvetii, a large confederation of Celtic tribes from what is now Switzerland, sought to migrate westward. Pressured by their neighbors, driven by population strain, they planned to abandon their lands and carve out a new home in western Gaul. Their movement threatened not only the balance of power among Gallic tribes, but also the security of Rome's allies. Tens of thousands of people, warriors, families, and baggage trains would sweep across the landscape, a human tide that no one could ignore. For Caesar, this was the perfect pretext. Rome could claim it was not the aggressor, but the defender, protecting allied tribes and the stability of the frontier. The Senate would see a responsible governor keeping order. The legions would see action, spoils, and glory, and Caesar himself would step onto the stage of history as Rome's savior. Thus, the Gallic Wars began not with a carefully planned invasion, but with the convergence of Roman ambition and Gallic unrest. Caesar presented his intervention as necessity, but it was more than defense. It was a chance to seize power, wealth, and fame. The Gauls themselves were not blind to Roman intentions. Some tribes courted Caesar, hoping to use Rome's power against rivals. Others resisted fiercely, unwilling to bend before foreign legions. Caesar exploited every fissure, every rivalry, turning the fractured politics of Gaul to his advantage. To the Romans, the Gauls were barbarians, but Caesar knew better. He recognized their courage, their skill in battle, and their deep sense of honor. He also recognized that they would never unite without a leader powerful enough to rally them all. And as long as that unity remained a dream, Caesar could conquer them piecemeal. The land itself played a role in the unfolding drama. Gaul was fertile and diverse, its plains and river valleys supporting agriculture, its forests and hills sheltering warriors. The Rhône, the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhine were highways of movement and trade, but also boundaries of influence. To command Gaul was to command not just land, but networks of power and commerce. For Rome, the economic prize was immense: grain to feed armies, slaves to enrich markets, and wealth to fill the treasury. Yet the conquest of Gaul was never inevitable. It was Caesar's will, his audacity, his relentless pursuit of opportunity that transformed a frontier command into a monumental campaign. From the very beginning, he wrote his own account of the wars, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, not merely as a record, but as propaganda, shaping how Romans would see both him and his enemies. In his words, Rome was always the defender, the Gauls always the aggressors, and Caesar always the man of destiny. The truth was more complex, but the narrative served its purpose, to elevate his stature at home while justifying his actions abroad. As we step into the story of the Gallic Wars, we see a clash not merely of armies but of worlds. On one side, a republic that demanded glory from its generals, but feared the power those generals amassed. On the other, a land of tribes fiercely proud yet divided, where resistance flickered brightly but struggled to unite. Between them stood Caesar, ambitious beyond measure, calculating, charismatic, and utterly relentless. The stage was set. Gaul, fragmented yet rich in warriors, faced a commander who saw in their divisions the key to his own rise. Rome, weary of threats from the north, embraced Caesar's campaigns as defense, even as they fueled his personal power. The Helvetii were moving, the Rhine frontier trembled, and the fires of conquest were about to ignite. Caesar's campaign was not simply about defense. It was about power, wealth, and fame, and Gaul offered all three. In the year 58 BC, the migrations of the Helvetii became the spark that lit Caesar's first war in Gaul. These tribes, numbering perhaps 300,000 men, women, and children, prepared to abandon their alpine valleys in search of fertile land further west. Their homeland had grown cramped, hemmed in by mountains and rival tribes, and their leaders dreamed of conquest and renewal in a new territory. But to achieve this, they would march through the lands of others, cutting a swath that could destabilize all of Gaul and bring them dangerously close to Roman borders. The Helvetii sent envoys to Caesar, asking passage through Roman-held territory in Narbonese Gaul. To march south of the Jura Mountains, they would need Roman permission to cross the province. Caesar, freshly arrived in command of his legions, understood immediately what this meant. Allowing the Helvetii free passage would bring tens of thousands of warriors through Roman soil, an army masked as a migration. Denying them would invite war. To Caesar, there was only one choice. He stalled for time, ordering his soldiers to destroy bridges across the Rhône and fortify positions along the river. When the Helvetii pressed, he rejected their request outright. And so, with the decision made, the Helvetii chose another route. They swung north, circumventing the Roman province and moving into the lands of the Aedui, a Gallic tribe allied to Rome. This migration soon left devastation in its wake. Settlements burned, fields plundered, neighboring tribes driven from their homes. The Aedui appealed to Caesar for aid, invoking their alliance with Rome and demanding protection. Caesar now had his casus belli. Rome could not ignore the pleas of its allies. Mobilizing his forces, Caesar marched north with a speed that stunned his enemies. The Roman legions were not only professional soldiers, but also masters of discipline and logistics. They built fortified camps at the end of each day's march, carrying with them not just weapons but the very tools of engineering. Caesar knew that victory depended not only on battlefield courage, but on outpacing and outmaneuvering his foes. At Bibracte, the Helvetii turned to face him. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic. Waves of Celtic warriors crashed against Roman shields, the air filled with the roar of horns and the clash of iron. Caesar, riding among his men, directed maneuvers with ruthless clarity. The Romans' discipline and formation proved decisive. Despite their bravery, the Helvetii were broken. Their migration collapsed, their dreams of a new homeland shattered. Survivors were forced back to their ancestral lands, their power broken, their people dispersed. Caesar portrayed it as a victory of civilization over chaos, Rome protecting its allies and stabilizing Gaul. In reality, it was the first step in his grand conquest. No sooner had the Helvetii been subdued than another threat loomed. Across the Rhine, Germanic tribes under the king Ariovistus had crossed into Gaul. The Suebi, fierce and warlike, had been drawn westward by promises of land and plunder. Ariovistus himself had been recognized by the Senate years earlier as a friend of Rome, when he was seen as a useful counterbalance against Gallic power. But alliances in Gaul shifted like the wind, and now Ariovistus's ambitions clashed with Roman interests. He had settled in Gaul with tens of thousands of followers, imposed himself upon Gallic tribes, and begun demanding hostages and tribute. For Caesar, this was intolerable. He cast Ariovistus not merely as a threat to Roman allies, but as an invader, a foreign king who endangered the entire balance of Gaul. In truth, it was also an opportunity. Defeating a Germanic chieftain would elevate Caesar's reputation immensely. The Senate might hesitate at wars of aggression, but they could hardly oppose a campaign against a dangerous intruder. At first, Caesar attempted diplomacy. He invited Ariovistus to talks, presenting himself as mediator and protector of Gaul. Ariovistus refused, replying with contempt. He was a conqueror in his own right, and Rome had no business interfering in Gallic affairs. The tension escalated quickly. Caesar advanced with his legions, but Ariovistus maneuvered skillfully, avoiding a pitched battle while attempting to starve and wear down the Romans. The Germanic warriors were fierce, their cavalry and infantry swift, their reputation terrifying to Gallic allies. Some tribes wavered in their loyalty, fearful that Caesar would be crushed, but Caesar would not be outmaneuvered. He forced Ariovistus into battle near Vesontio. In the brutal clash that followed, Roman discipline again proved decisive. The Germans charged with ferocity, but the legions held their lines, driving them back with Pila and Gladius, closing shield to shield in relentless advance. The Suebi were routed, Ariovistus himself barely escaping across the Rhine with the remnants of his host. The threat of Germanic expansion into Gaul was broken, and Caesar stood triumphant. In the space of a single year, Caesar had crushed the Helvetii, expelled the Germans, and established himself as Rome's protector on the northern frontier. His reputation soared. In Rome, news of his victories spread like wildfire, and the Senate, however wary of his ambition, could not deny the brilliance of his command. To the people, he was a hero. To his soldiers, he was a leader whose daring and skill brought them spoils and honor. But Caesar knew this was only the beginning. The Helvetii and Ariovistus were merely the opening acts. Gaul was vast, its tribes restless, and its politics unstable. Already, Roman involvement had shifted the balance of power. Allies who had called for Caesar's help now found themselves bound ever tighter to Roman command. Enemies who resisted discovered the terrible price of defiance. Caesar had shown both stick and carrot, protection for those who submitted, destruction for those who opposed. Over the next campaigns, Caesar would learn to wield these tools with masterful precision. He exploited rivalries, playing tribe against tribe, always ensuring that Rome appeared as the arbiter of disputes while secretly advancing his own domination. Gaul was not conquered in a single sweep of arms. It was absorbed, coerced, broken, and reassembled under Roman power. By the end of his early campaigns, Caesar had secured a foothold that no Roman general before him had achieved. His legions were hardened, his officers tested, his enemies wary. Gaul was beginning to realize that the Roman commander was no temporary visitor, but a force intent on reshaping their world. And all of this was carefully recorded in Caesar's own words. In his Commentari de Bello Gallico, he described these events with calculated precision. The Helvetii were aggressors, Ariovistus was a tyrant, Rome acted only to defend allies and restore balance. The legions, he claimed, brought order where chaos had reigned. Every victory was framed as justice, every campaign as necessity. It was a masterclass in propaganda, a narrative that justified conquest while glorifying its author. As the legions wintered in Gaul, Caesar was already planning his next moves. The Belgae to the north, the Veneti on the Atlantic coast, the restless tribes along the Rhine, all would soon feel the weight of Roman steel. Caesar had won his first triumphs, but the conquest of Gaul had only just begun. By the spring of 57 BC, Caesar has victories over the Helvetii and Ariovistus had already transformed him into a figure of immense power. Yet Gaul was far from subdued. To the north lay the Belgae, a formidable confederation of tribes occupying what is now Belgium and parts of northern France. Fiercely independent, proud of their warrior traditions, the Belgae were wary of Roman encroachment. Their leaders saw Caesar's intervention in central Gaul not as protection, but as a prelude to domination. Rumors spread quickly across the tribal networks. Caesar had defeated the Helvetii with ruthless efficiency, crushed the Germans, and presented himself as protector of Rome's allies. To the Belgae, these victories were ominous. If Rome remained unchecked, they too would fall under Caesar's shadow. And so the Belgae did what the Gauls so rarely managed. They united. A massive confederation formed, bringing together tribes who set aside rivalries for the sake of resisting Rome. Their combined forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands or so, Caesar claimed, a coalition unlike any Rome had faced in Gaul. Caesar, ever the strategist, recognized both the danger and the opportunity. A united Gallic front was rare, but also fragile. If he could shatter this alliance, he could prevent such unity from rising again. He marched north with speed, drawing his legions into Belgic territory. But he moved with caution, testing his foes, probing their weaknesses. The Belgae, determined to show strength, laid siege to Roman-allied towns. They assaulted the Remi, a tribe that had chosen to side with Caesar, and burned villages along the frontier. The violence only strengthened Caesar's resolve. He marched his legions to the Ain River, fortifying a camp on high ground and daring the Belgae to attack. They swarmed forward in a massive host, but the Romans held firm. When the Belgae attempted to cross the river, Caesar's men counterattacked with devastating effect, driving them back with pila and cutting them down as they fled into the water. But the confederation did not collapse immediately. Caesar pursued them, tribe by tribe, dismantling the alliance with relentless determination. Each tribe that broke from the coalition was punished or coerced into submission. The Nervi, however, proved the most dangerous of all. Fierce and uncompromising, they despised Roman interference and prepared an ambush that nearly ended Caesar's campaigns. As Caesar's column marched, the Nervi struck with ferocity, catching the Romans off guard. For a moment the legions wavered, their baggage train overrun, their formations disrupted. Caesar himself, in the thick of battle, seized a shield and rallied his men. The fighting was desperate, chaotic, and bloody. Yet Roman discipline, honed by years of training, slowly prevailed. The Nervi were shattered, their warriors cut down almost to the last man. Caesar described their annihilation with grim admiration, noting that they had fought with a courage worthy of memory, even as their people were nearly erased. With the fall of the Nervi, Belgic resistance collapsed. Some tribes sued for peace, others fled into forests and marshes, their strength broken. Caesar had done more than defeat them. He had demonstrated that no alliance could stand against Rome. Divide and conquer would become his most effective weapon, exploiting the mistrust and rivalries among the tribes. While the Belgae fell, Caesar turned his attention westward to the Atlantic coast, where the Veneti held sway. Masters of the sea, the Veneti commanded trade routes across the Channel, linking Gaul with Britain. They possessed something Caesar's legions had never faced before, a powerful navy. When the Veneti defied Roman demands and seized Roman envoys, Caesar responded with a campaign unlike any he had attempted. To defeat the Veneti, he would need to challenge them on the water. The Veneti's ships were heavy, built of solid oak, their sails of leather rather than cloth, their hulls designed to withstand Atlantic storms. They towered above Roman vessels, and their knowledge of the tides and currents gave them an immense advantage. Caesar's men, unaccustomed to naval warfare, faced a daunting challenge. But Caesar refused to accept weakness. He ordered the construction of a fleet, drawing sailors and shipwrights from allied tribes. The Romans adapted, equipping their lighter ships with hooks and boarding devices designed to tear down the Veneti sails and drag their ships into close combat. The climactic naval battle was unlike anything in Caesar's career. On rolling waves, under the vast sky of the Atlantic, Roman ships clashed with the Veneti fleet. Slowly, through innovation and sheer persistence, the Romans turned the tide. One by one, Veneti ships were immobilized, boarded, and destroyed. Their sea power shattered, their towns fell soon after. Caesar, determined to make an example, punished them severely. Their leaders were executed, their people sold into slavery. The message was clear. Defiance against Rome would not only fail but bring destruction. Even as he subdued the Veneti, Caesar's ambition pushed further. Beyond the Rhine, Germanic tribes stirred once more, testing the frontier. To secure his position and awe both Gauls and Germans, Caesar conceived a bold demonstration of Roman might, the construction of a bridge across the Rhine itself. It was a feat of engineering, as much as a military act. In just 10 days, Roman legionaries constructed a massive timber bridge, spanning the wide and turbulent waters of the Rhine. With it, Caesar led his legions across, not to occupy, but to intimidate. He marched briefly through German lands, burning villages, showing that Rome could cross into their world at will. Then, just as swiftly, he withdrew, dismantling the bridge behind him. The message echoed through Gaul and beyond. No river, no boundary could shield Rome's enemies. From there, Caesar turned his gaze across the sea. Britain, mysterious and half-legendary to the Romans, lay just beyond the horizon. Traders spoke of its tin, its fierce tribes, its strange customs. For Caesar, an expedition to Britain promised not only plunder, but prestige. To be the first Roman commander to set foot on that distant island would add luster to his name, a triumph of daring and vision. In 55 BC, he launched his first expedition. It was modest, a probing force more than a conquest, but the attempt carried immense symbolic weight. Roman ships crossed the Channel, landing on Britain's shores under the watchful eyes of Celtic chariots and warriors. The landing was perilous, soldiers leaping into the surf, shields raised against missiles from the beach, yet they fought their way ashore, establishing a fragile foothold. The campaign, plagued by storms and logistical difficulties, achieved little militarily. But Caesar returned to Gaul with stories of Britain, presenting the expedition as a bold achievement, proof that his reach extended beyond the known world. The following year, he returned with greater force, pressing deeper inland, battling tribes and receiving hostages. Again, the conquest was incomplete, the resistance fierce, the challenges immense. Yet for Roman audiences, these ventures were glorious, proof of Caesar's ambition and Rome's growing power. Gaul was no longer the boundary of his vision. He had carried the eagle across the sea. By 54 BC, Caesar's reputation had grown beyond measure. In just a few years, he had crushed the Helvetii, expelled the Germans, dismantled the Belgic Confederation, annihilated the Veneti, crossed the Rhine, and twice invaded Britain. Each campaign added to his legend. Each victory cemented his dominance. His soldiers adored him, for he shared their hardships, rewarded their loyalty, and led them to glory. His enemies feared him, knowing that resistance meant destruction. Yet beneath the triumphs, tension simmered. The brutality of Roman campaigns, the slaughter of tribes, the enslavement of captives, and the constant demands of tribute bred resentment. Gaul was not pacified, it was seething. The more Caesar pressed, the more hatred grew among those who had lost lands, families, or freedom to Rome's advance. And among the Gauls, whispers began to spread that one day someone would unite them against their conqueror. But for now, Caesar stood at the height of his power in Gaul. Divide and conquer had carried him far. He had turned rivalries into weapons, engineered spectacles of engineering and daring, and transformed himself from a debt-ridden politician into Rome's greatest general. Yet the story of the Gallic Wars was far from over. The greatest test still lay ahead, in the fires of rebellion that would sweep across Gaul and bring Caesar face to face with the most formidable opponent he had ever encountered. By the year 53 BC, Caesar had achieved triumphs that few generals in Roman history could match. His legions had marched across rivers, seas, and forests, subduing tribe after tribe, forging alliances where it suited him, and crushing resistance where it did not. He had spread Rome's shadow from the Alps to the Atlantic, from the Rhine to the shores of Britain. Yet even as his reputation reached dizzying heights, the seeds of rebellion had been planted across Gaul. Every tribe that had bent the knee to Rome carried within it a smouldering anger, the memory of lost freedom, the pain of tribute, and the humiliation of submission. For years, resentment had festered beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark to ignite. The spark came in the winter of 54 to 53 BC, when Roman brutality reached new heights. Caesar, driven by the need to supply his legions, demanded heavy tribute and requisitions of grain from the Gallic tribes. To some, this was unbearable. That winter, the Eburones, led by their chieftain Ambiorix, launched a sudden and devastating uprising. They attacked a Roman winter camp, luring its commanders into a trap with false promises of safe passage. The legions, marching out in disarray, were ambushed and annihilated. Thousands of Roman soldiers were slaughtered, their commanders cut down, their standards lost. It was one of the worst disasters Caesar's forces had suffered in Gaul. The revolt spread quickly. Tribes that had bowed before Caesar's victories now saw weakness. If Rome could be defeated once, it could be defeated again. Ambiorix became a symbol of resistance, his daring strike celebrated across the land. Caesar, furious, responded with swift vengeance. He marched through Belgic territory with fire and sword, devastating the lands of the Eburones, destroying crops, burning villages, and leaving desolation in his wake. The message was merciless. Resistance meant annihilation. Yet vengeance could not erase the truth that had been revealed, that the legions were not invincible. The Gallic world had tasted blood, and the dream of freedom stirred once more. The following year, in 52 BC, that dream found its leader. His name was Vercingetorix. A noble of the Arverni tribe, young yet brilliant, he possessed both charisma and vision. Unlike so many Gallic leaders before him, he understood that the only path to victory was unity. Divided, the tribes had fallen one by one before Caesar's legions. United, they might stand a chance. Rising in rebellion, Vercingetorix called upon the tribes of Gaul to cast off their submission to Rome and fight together for independence. His call was answered. From the hills of central Gaul to the plains of the north, tribes rallied to his banner. Vercingetorix employed a strategy unlike any Caesar had faced before. Rather than offering battle on Roman terms, he turned to scorched earth tactics. He ordered villages and fields burned before the advancing Romans, denying them food and shelter. He understood that Caesar's strength lay not only in his soldiers, but in the logistical machine that sustained them. Deprive him of supplies, stretch his lines, and the legions might falter. Caesar, recognizing the gravity of the threat, moved with his characteristic speed. He gathered his legions and marched against the rebellion, determined to crush it before it could engulf all of Gaul. The two sides clashed in a series of brutal encounters. At Gergovia, the stronghold of the Arverni, Caesar suffered a rare and stinging defeat. The Gallic warriors, defending their high fortress, repelled Roman assaults with ferocity. For the first time, Caesar was forced into retreat, his aura of invincibility shaken. The victory electrified the rebellion, and more tribes flocked to Vercingetorix's side. But Caesar was not defeated. He regrouped, adapted, and turned the campaign into one of attrition and maneuver. He pursued Vercingetorix relentlessly, forcing him to withdraw into the fortified town of Alesia, a hilltop stronghold in the territory of the Mandubi. There, the fate of Gaul would be decided. Alesia was a natural fortress, its walls perched on high ground, protected by rivers and steep slopes. Vercingetorix gathered tens of thousands of warriors inside, while calling for reinforcements from allied tribes across Gaul. If the Gallic host could hold long enough, relief forces would arrive and crush the Romans between hammer and anvil. Caesar, faced with a formidable fortress and an enemy army larger than his own, chose a solution that was audacious, perhaps insane. He would not storm Alesia, but encircle it. His legions began constructing lines of fortifications, first a massive ring of walls, trenches, and towers surrounding Alesia itself, designed to starve out the defenders. Then, anticipating the arrival of Gallic reinforcements, Caesar ordered a second line of fortifications facing outward. In effect, his army built a double wall, one to keep Vercingetorix in, the other to keep rescuers out. The scale of the works was staggering. Miles upon miles of trenches, palisades, and ramparts encircled the fortress. The Romans dug pits filled with sharpened stakes, concealed traps and obstacles designed to break enemy charges. Day and night, the legionaries labored, engineers directing the construction with precision. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, a fortress built not to protect a city, but to imprison an enemy army. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched as the ring tightened. Supplies dwindled, hunger gnawed at the defenders, yet they held on, awaiting relief. And relief did come. A massive Gallic army, perhaps numbering in the hundreds of thousands according to Caesar's account, assembled to break the siege. The fields around Alesia became the stage for one of the most extraordinary battles of the ancient world. The Gallic relief forces hurled themselves against Caesar's outer fortifications, while Vercingetorix's men sallied forth from within, striking at the inner walls. The Romans, trapped between two enemies, fought desperately. Battle raged along the ramparts, at the trenches, in the killing fields filled with traps. Arrows and stones rained down, cavalry clashed, infantry surged. Time and again, the Gauls nearly broke through. At one point, Caesar himself rode to the critical sector, rallying his men, directing reinforcements, holding the line by sheer force of will. At last, after days of relentless struggle, the relief forces were repelled. Exhausted, shattered, and demoralized, they melted away, retreating from the battlefield. Inside Alesia, hope collapsed. With no food, no reinforcements, and no way out, Vercingetorix made his decision. In a gesture that would become legend, he rode forth from the gates of Alesia, clad in armor, and surrendered himself to Caesar. The fall of Alesia was not just a Roman victory. It was the death knell of Gallic independence. The dream of unity had been broken, the greatest uprising crushed. Vercingetorix, once hailed as the liberator of Gaul, was taken prisoner, destined to languish in chains until his execution in Rome years later. For Caesar, Alesia was the crowning triumph of his career. The double fortifications, the encirclement, the victory against overwhelming odds, these became proof of his genius, immortalized in his commentaries. To his soldiers, it was a testament to their discipline and endurance. To the Senate and people of Rome, it was a spectacle of conquest unmatched in living memory. But to the Gauls, it was catastrophe. Their greatest leader had fallen, their last great chance at freedom extinguished. Though resistance would flicker on in scattered rebellions, Gaul was now firmly in Rome's grip. Its lands, its people, its wealth, all would be drawn into the orbit of the Republic. And yet the consequences of Alesia stretched far beyond Gaul. For Caesar himself, the victory propelled him to heights of power and prestige that would transform Rome itself. He had conquered not only a land but a legend, and in doing so, he had set in motion events that would shake the Republic to its core. The smoke had barely cleared from the fields around Alesia when Caesar moved to consolidate his grip on Gaul. Though Vercingetorix had surrendered and the great coalition was shattered, Gaul was not yet silent. Smaller tribes still resisted, embers of defiance glowing faintly amid the ashes of defeat. Caesar understood that conquest was not a single event, but a process. Victory on the battlefield had to be followed by years of pacification, of crushing rebellions, of binding allies ever more tightly to Rome. In the months that followed Alesia, Caesar led his legions on punitive campaigns across Gaul. Settlements suspected of harboring resistance were destroyed, fields devastated, and leaders executed. The Romans imposed garrisons and demanded hostages as guarantees of loyalty. Some tribes submitted readily, hoping to preserve what they could. Others resisted desperately, fighting hopeless skirmishes that only brought harsher retribution. By 51 BC, most of Gaul had been brought to heel. The Great Rebellion was over, though the cost in blood and devastation was immense. For the Gallic peoples, the consequences were profound. Their independence was gone, their nobility humbled, their warriors dead or enslaved. Roman administration, taxation, and cultural influence began to spread through their lands. Over the coming generations, the Gauls would be drawn into the Roman world, their cities remade in Roman style, their children learning Latin alongside their native tongues, their warriors serving in Roman armies. Resistance would flare up occasionally, but never again would Gaul unite in a bid for freedom, as it had under Vercingetorix. For Rome, the rewards were staggering. The conquest of Gaul added an enormous territory to the Republic, rich in resources and fertile in land. Grain, timber, metals, and above all, slaves poured into Roman markets. The spoils of war enriched Caesar's coffers, erasing his debts and filling his treasury with unimaginable wealth. His soldiers, too, profited, each man receiving his share of plunder, each soldier bound by gratitude and loyalty to their commander. Caesar had not only conquered a province, he had forged an army whose devotion was to him personally, rather than to the Senate. This perhaps was the most significant legacy of the Gallic Wars. The legions that followed Caesar were veterans hardened by years of relentless campaigning. They had fought across rivers, forests, mountains, and seas. They had triumphed against enemies of every kind: Helvetii migrants, Germanic warriors, Belgic confederations, seafaring Veneti, and the united tribes of Gaul. Their loyalty was not abstract. It was born of shared hardship, of victories won under Caesar's command, of spoils distributed by his hand. They would follow him anywhere, even against fellow Romans. Caesar understood this, and so did his enemies in Rome. News of his conquests spread throughout the Republic, and with it came both admiration and fear. The people adored him. His commentaries, widely circulated, presented him as Rome's protector, a man who had expanded the Republic's borders and brought glory beyond imagining. The Senate, however, grew uneasy. A general who commanded such loyalty, who had enriched himself and his men, was a potential threat to the Republic's fragile balance of power. By 50 BC, Caesar's governorship was nearing its end. According to Roman law, he was expected to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar knew that once stripped of command, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies in the Senate, who resented his power and sought to bring him down. He could not afford to relinquish his army. The legions, forged in Gaul, were his shield and his sword in the political battles to come. The conquest of Gaul had given Caesar the means to challenge the Republic itself. When the Senate, allied with Pompey, demanded that he surrender his command, Caesar made his fateful decision. In 49 BC, he led his veteran legions across the Rubicon River, declaring war not only on his political opponents, but on the very institutions of the Republic. The Gallic Wars had been the crucible in which his power was forged. The civil war was the inevitable result. The campaigns in Gaul thus reshaped not only the tribes of the north, but the destiny of Rome itself. They elevated Caesar from an ambitious politician drowning in debt to a conqueror whose name commanded awe and fear. They created an army whose loyalty would tip the scales in the struggle for power. And they provided the wealth and prestige that allowed Caesar to stand as Rome's most dominant figure, paving the way for his eventual rise as dictator for life. But beyond Rome and Caesar, the conquest carried consequences for all of Europe. The absorption of Gaul into the Roman sphere linked the Mediterranean world more closely with the lands of the north. Roads, cities, and trade networks would spread across the region, integrating it into the economic and cultural fabric of the empire. The descendants of the conquered Gauls would one day serve as emperors, generals, and senators in the very state that had subdued them. Out of conquest came integration, and out of destruction came transformation. And yet, even as Rome celebrated victory, the memory of Gallic resistance endured. Vercingetorix, paraded through Rome in chains before his execution, became in later centuries a symbol of courage and defiance, a reminder that even in defeat, the Gauls had dared to challenge the might of Rome. His stand at Alesia would echo through history, retold as a legend of resistance against impossible odds. In the end, the Gallic Wars were more than a conquest. They were a turning point in history. They transformed Caesar into a figure whose ambition would unravel the Republic. They reshaped Gaul, binding it into the Roman world. They demonstrated both the power of Roman military discipline and the tragedy of tribal disunity. And they set in motion the events that would lead to the fall of the Republic and the birth of the Empire. The Gallic Wars were more than a conquest. They transformed Rome, elevated Caesar, and changed European history forever. From the ashes of Gallic independence, an empire was forged,